I made a big life mistake that had consequences.
With your movie Sight, you began writing in 2015. What was the very first idea you had about this story? Do you remember?
I do. I was very fascinated by the ideas of reincarnation at the time, and I was reading a lot about reincarnation. And I had heard some anecdotes, even within my own family, of some people, especially acquaintances of my mother, that had very strange experiences of knowing about people and little towns and places that they felt such an acute affinity towards and felt like they had experienced being there before, and then actually went to these places and found that there was evidence that the things they were remembering and thinking of were real. So I had a bit of just sort of like, I had a bit of grounding, if you want to call it that, in personal anecdote about this kind of thing. I had never experienced anything that made me personally feel that I had been, in another previous life or anything like that. But I was reading a fair amount about it, and I thought there's something very interesting here in terms of creating characters or looking into how this would bloom into characters, because you're dealing with the idea of karma and of handing off sort of unresolved particulars in one life onto a current life or another precursor life, whatever the case may be. And I just thought there was something very interesting and unique about exploring that.
So in thinking about reincarnation and some of these other sort of, if you want to call them esoteric thoughts, did you have a feeling right away that this would morph into a movie? If you sat down and wrote the screenplay?
I mean, I always come from when I start to cultivate an idea, I always think about it in the terms of, can this be a screenplay? Can there be a story here? Because that's the way I can do something with the idea. I always feel a need to kind of like make something out of an idea. I have to get it down in some way to kind of like rein it in and give it shape, So I always think about it through the lens of, well, can I like outline something here? Are there 3 acts of story, or whatever your act structure preference is? Some people do 8 now, but can I tell a story within this idea? And I started to kind of note and outline concepts, do some some character bio work to try to kind of sketch up who might be the characters in the story, what's the framework. So yeah, I mean, it starts with early rumblings like that in my process.
What's your actual process for building out a story?
That takes a number of forms. In my recent career, I've had the good fortune of working from underlying IP quite a few times. So if it's a nonfiction book, which I've done 2 times over in the last 5 years, one adapted into a show, one adapted into a feature, that at least gives you sort of a framework, even though you have to be still very, very creative within the adaptation and deciding what to pull out of it and what to sort of, what characters to focus on, what aspects of that underlying material you want to really create into engaging storytelling in a visual medium. But when it comes to creating an idea sort of out of thin air, like Sight was made just from, early thematic issues that I was exploring, like we discussed with the reincarnation early on, certain reflections of my own negative patterns that I kept repeating in my life that I wanted to explore almost in a kind of a therapeutic way initially. My process with kind of building story is similar in both contexts, when it's coming from an underlying piece of material and when it's coming from totally, blank, out of nowhere, just imaginative gestation. In both cases, I always work from theme. I always, that gives me a frame, that gives me a sandbox to kind of put everything inside of, because I know a lot of people work just from character to begin. They may work from plot to begin and know that, you know, it's going to start here and it's going to end here, and these are the twists. There's virtue to that, and you got to get to those points. But I always start in story process from the theme, because I want everything to be aware at every turn and every decision that's made with plotting and with character, that it's unpacking the thematic engine of the story. What is the story? Why tell the story? What is it about? What is it saying as a conceptual statement? And that doesn't need to be in a movie. Some movies don't have a statement or a theme that they're necessarily trying to convey. You don't have to have that. But I always use that as an organizational and divining principle of how to find my steps. Because if I make decisions that aren't keeping with the theme, or choose character dynamics, or choose plotting decisions that aren't playing into the greater theme, then I know I've sort of strayed out of my own constellation. I'm sort of orbiting out in space, and I don't know how to get back to where I was. So I like to start from theme and make sure at every point I'm sort of stress testing my decisions. Is it still building towards the greater statement that I want the whole piece to make? So I know some writers, they find their theme sort of as they go, or they find it as an emergent property of the work. It sort of bubbles up, and that I'm sure works wonderfully too. But I go in the other way. I start from theme, and then I build the story, knowing and analyzing at each juncture whether I'm continuing to enhance the theme by those decisions.
Do you remember the day in 2015 when you sat down and said, "I'm writing this"?
I do. I do. I made a big life mistake that had consequences. And when I had done that, and I faced the music with that, and went through a lot of grieving and self reflection about what I had done, then it really became sort of an outgrowth of that I decided it would be actually healthy and redemptive for me to sink into telling a story about this kind of thing, about these negative cycles, because I wanted it to be sort of a method of myself also contextualizing what I had just gone through, and how to kind of put it into something constructive in the work.
How does being an editor affect your writing?
I can't tell you how valuable I think it has been, because so often in editing, in narrative, storytelling editing, you're getting around problems. You're trying to find your way out of, where too much has been said, or a scene is dragging, or it's beating a dead horse. You get it, and it's just overwritten, or there's too much there, or even if the director has painted themselves into a corner and the coverage doesn't let you get to where you need to go to make the scene work, those reverse engineer a lot of understanding about when you're writing material. And once you've gone through the process of whatever aspect of making movies, whether you're editing it, whether you've written it, whether you're directing it, what have you, once you start to kind of go through the process a number enough times, you get this feeling of, in the writing process, like, it doesn't need to be there. Yeah, maybe it's a cool line and you really like, it's got some zesty language to it or something, but then you're like, do you need it? Is it going to play? Is it going to slow things down? Is it going to seem scripted? I mean, there's those things that you see from the back end editing material that really forces you to kind of confront it on the way in when you're writing, because you have this sense of like, I could sort of envision what this scene's going to play like as I'm writing it, right? I see it as a mental image of the scene playing out on screen, and then I kind of think into it as an editor, and I'm like, this thing is like 6 pages now, and everybody's saying what they're feeling. They don't need to say it; just have them feel it, and you'll get it. So cut it. But also as a writer, we're also self-policing so often that we don't want the reader to not get our intentions, right? Or the executive is going to decide whether or not to make your material, like, not get it. So you're in a bit of a pickle because you want it to be very clear what's being communicated. You want the characters to be clearly mapping their emotionality throughout the script, which has to be done in language, right? Because you don't see it yet. You haven't shot it yet. But at the same time, when you're looking at the execution, forecasting the execution of actually shooting a scene when you're writing it, then you start to look at it as an editor and as a filmmaker, and not just as a potential reader of the screenplay. And say, this is going to get cut. I know this is going to get cut, and you have to. I find myself striking a balance because I want the reader to get the intended material from a scene, even if sometimes I know, all right, well, when it comes to shooting, this is going to go because the actor is going to be able to perform what's being said without needing to say it. You know what I mean? So it's had a very technically functional impact on my writing to have been an editor. And a lot on my directing too, because when you block a scene, when you start to envision the coverage for a scene, you've got to think about it through an editorial lens, because you back yourself into some bad corners if you don't. Because if you don't have the coverage, always leaving yourself ways to get out and get around if there's problems, or if you need to foreshorten a scene, for the flow of things, and you don't have the ability to have a cut point, like if everything's done in a oneer, if it's just like a one-off with a roving camera, there's nothing to cut to. There's no way to get out of it. There's no way to have a backup plan. So all that coming in as an editor informs certainly writing, but I think also very much directing as well.
Right. I think you said earlier on in our session today that Murphy's Law, there's going to be weather issues, illness, interpersonal dynamics or whatever. But when you get into the womb of the editing sort of bay, magic can occur. Yeah.
There is nothing. It is the weirdest alchemical process, I think, when you get into the editing, where you put these little clips of material together, and all of a sudden a scene starts to play, and it starts to cook, and it's working. And it is one of the most gratifying things there is, because you can, when you're writing and you're in the flow and you think you just banged out just a screamer of a scene, you come back and you look at it in your revisions, you're like, all right, okay, all right, maybe change this, move this around. You might get that buzz the first time you're like really plugged into that, writing that scene. But then it kind of fades into technique, and you've got to go in and refine it, and you start thinking with your less, emotional hat on of like, can this play? Does this make sense? Is the character really saying something they would say? That kind of thing. But when you get into the editing and the scene starts dictating what it wants of itself, because you put those great performance bits against one another, and it like really is starting to engage you now as sort of, you get to become sort of a passive viewer once you start to get into the editing, because you become, you need to see if the scene is moving you, right? You need to see if you're like engaged. Are you entertaining yourself? And that is the point of the process where you really start to see if it's working. And when it does, and this crazy magical, as you put it, process of seeing a scene come together from editing those bits together, that to me is probably one of the most gratifying parts of the entire process. And when you see a scene start to work, is really like, it's a blessed thing.
Is that sort of the saying, like the movie tells you what it wants to be?
Yeah. And I think I was trying to sort of put that idea across earlier, just about creative ideas in general. I think you have to let them tell you. That doesn't mean like just be totally creatively passive and just anything goes. Of course not, quite the opposite. But the idea, the scene, it needs to be allowed to take on a life of its own. outside of you overly micromanaging what you thought it was going to be and what you want it to be. Let it do its best at what it's capable of being, and who knows, you might end up pretty damn surprised. I've seen scenes I didn't think that much about even when shooting them. They were a little bit like kind of connective tissue bits that you kind of needed, but they weren't like standout, like I can't wait until we shoot the scene. And then you see some really interesting things happening in the performances or in something in the cinematography, or it's just a great camera move or something. And then you're like, whoa, this all of a sudden became something special. I didn't know this was going to be anything. I thought this was just shoe leather getting us to the next bit of, storytelling. So the editing room is where you gotta be ready and willing to be surprised. And that means also just being like, this scene's gotta go. I know I loved it when I wrote it, but it's DVD extras time,
Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. Here is a complimentary question from our book Story Questions.